What's going on, everybody? Welcome back into the FantasyPros YouTube channel. My name is Lucas Wencl, and today we are talking about 10 players that you should be looking to stash ahead of the Week 14 slate and ahead of next week's waiver run as well. Before we dive on into that list of players, though, you can take the guesswork out of waiver wire decisions with FantasyPros Waiver Assistant. It will give you instant analysis on potential moves from over 100 fantasy experts. You'll also discover both the weekly and rest of season impact for every waiver ad. All you have to do is visit fantasypros.com/myplaybook or download the Fantasy Football My Playbook app. Again, all you have to do is visit fantasypros.com/myplaybook or download the Fantasy Football My Playbook app to optimize your roster today. Kicking off our list this week is Buffalo Bills running back Ray Davis, who's rostered in 18% of leagues. The fact that Ray Davis is rostered in less than 20% of leagues at this point of the season is wild to me. We just saw him finish as the running back 19 in week 13 with 13.7 fantasy points on 12 touches and a score. I completely understand the snowy conditions drove Buffalo to a run-first approach, but Davis is one of the most premier handcuffs in all of fantasy football. We've seen other flashes of standalone value when he scored 11.7 points in week 7 and 17 points against the Dolphins in week 9. But we've also seen him take over for an injured James Cook. He scored 18.2 fantasy points against the Jets in week 6 on 23 opportunities. If anything happens to James Cook, Ray Davis is clearly first in line with the potential to be a league winner down the stretch if he becomes the lead back. Stashing handcuff running backs down the stretch is an absolute must to stay ahead of your league mates. So go get Ray Davis on your roster before somebody else in your league does. Our second stash this week is Elijah Moore, wide receiver for the Cleveland Browns. Elijah Moore is fresh off a 14-target game against the Broncos on Monday Night Football, where he caught 8 of those targets for 111 yards while finishing as the wide receiver 15 on the week. Since Jameis Winston took over at quarterback in week 8, Moore is averaging 9.4 targets per game, which is a top 10 mark in the league during that stretch. That volume has turned into 3 top 24 finishes at the position and has been worthy of flex consideration recently. You can argue that Moore saw a bump last week without teammate Cedric Tillman, but even with Tillman in the lineup, Moore had seen 8+ targets in 3 of those 4 games. As long as Jameis Winston is at quarterback, this team is going to be slinging the rock all around the yard, and at this point in the season, this is a pass-catching group you want a piece of. The next player to consider stashing is running back Blake Corum of the Los Angeles Rams, who's rostered in 16% of leagues. Week 13 marked career highs for Blake Corum in both carries and yards, racking up 42 of them on 8 totes. Obviously, 4.2 fantasy points is nothing to write home about, but we've known for the entire season that Corum is going to have 0 standalone value while Kyren Williams is healthy. However, one of the primary reasons Corum was drafted so heavily coming into the season was because of his handcuff value. That value matters now more than ever with the fantasy playoffs on the line. I am certainly not wishing injury upon Kyren Williams, but there's still 4 to 5 weeks left for him to get injured, and should that happen, Blake Corum is going to get the first go at lead back duties for Sean McVay. These backup running backs and high-powered offenses could be league winners down the stretch if things fall their way, so instead of keeping a low-ceiling player like Tyler Lockett on your team, stash a guy like Blake Corum instead. Coming in next, we have Dallas Cowboys wide receiver Brandin Cooks, who's rostered in 13% of leagues. Cooks made his return on Thanksgiving against the Giants after a 7-game absence and managed to find the end zone. He could only muster up 16 yards on the afternoon though, but there is room for optimism moving forward. He drew 7 targets in his return and gets a juicy schedule coming up. He draws the Bengals, Panthers, and Buccaneers in his next 3 games, and the Bengals and Bucs are both top 4 in schedule-adjusted fantasy points allowed to the position over the last 5 weeks. In deeper leagues, Cooks may actually be in flex consideration for you, so scoop him off the waiver wire now that he's back and on the field for the Dallas Cowboys. Another handcuff running back you should look to stash is Kimani Vidal of the Los Angeles Chargers, who's rostered in 13% of leagues. Gus Edwards still led the backfield against the Falcons in week 13, playing 52% of the snaps to Vidal's 26%, but what's clear is that Vidal has the most juice out of any running back in this backfield. He had a 16-yard carry last week, which was longer than any run Gus Edwards or Hassan Haskins have had all year, according to Hayden Winks. There's a lot Vidal needs to improve upon to be trusted with more playing time, and the Chiefs aren't exactly the matchup you want to target for fantasy running backs. That all being said, if anything happens to Gus Edwards, we're looking at Kimani Vidal as the potential lead back in a run-heavy Greg Roman offense with J.K. Dobbins on IR. You may not reap the potential rewards of Vidal in week 14, but there's opportunity ahead in weeks 15 to 17. Next on our stash list is Washington Commanders wide receiver Noah Brown, who's rostered in 8% of leagues. I am fully aware Noah Brown is on bye in week 14, but I never want to leave anything to chance with the fantasy playoffs in the picture. I also realize Noah Brown's production hasn't been that desirable recently either, but I'm willing to chase his volume in Washington's high-octane offense down the stretch. Since week 8, Noah Brown actually has a higher target share than Terry McLaurin, drawing 6+ targets in 4 of those 6 games. The Commanders wide receivers also draw the Saints and Falcons in 2 of their 3 games coming out of the bye, who are both top 8 in fantasy points allowed to the position this year. This stash is likely for those of you in deeper leagues who need wide receiver depth, and you could certainly do worse than Noah Brown. We're diving deep down the waiver wire for these last few players, starting with new San Francisco 49ers running back Israel Abanikanda, who's rostered in only 3% of leagues. Everyone is going to be talking about Isaac Guerrero and his league-winning upside with CMC and Jordan Mason ruled out for the rest of the fantasy season. But what if it isn't a foregone conclusion that Guerrero is the team's workhorse? That's not to say he won't be the lead back in week 14, he almost certainly will. But what if Israel Abanikanda impresses Kyle Shanahan after claiming him off waivers earlier this week? Is there a world where he potentially gets the majority of the work ahead of Guerrero? I honestly think there might be. I certainly don't expect it to happen in week 14, but the 49ers schedule coming up is pretty soft for running backs, making Abanikanda intriguing in deep league formats. Another wide receiver to consider stashing this week is Parker Washington of the Jacksonville Jaguars, who's rostered in 3% of leagues. Is his 24.3 point explosion against the Texans last week likely an outlier? Absolutely. Am I willing to chase that one game in deep league formats where my options may be completely thinned out? Absolutely. I certainly don't expect Washington to draw another 12 targets in tough matchups against the Titans and Jets, but most of your options on the waiver wire in deep league formats can hardly provide you 4 targets per game. I know it's also detrimental that Mac Jones is now his quarterback, but again, I'm talking from a deep league perspective here. If you need a warm body at the wide receiver position, Parker Washington at least showed you major signs of life last week. The last handcuff running back we'll talk about this week is Dameon Pierce of the Houston Texans, who's rostered in 2% of leagues. Joe Mixon has been dominating snaps and touches all season long, so there is zero standalone value here for Pierce. However, the volume has been so heavily favoring Mixon, there's a lot to be redistributed if he were to miss any time down the stretch. As of right now, the team only has Dameon Pierce and Dare Ogunbowale behind him, and Pierce would likely be first in line to get a crack at being the lead back for this Texans team in the home stretch. If you're the Joe Mixon manager, this stash is likely most important to you to make sure you have the running back 2 in fantasy points per game this year insured for the rest of the season. Last but not least, for all of you playing in leagues where you start a defense and special teams unit, you can look to stash the Washington Commanders, who are rostered in 15% of leagues. Yes, the Commanders, they are on bye this week as we established earlier with Noah Brown, but this makes them the perfect defense to stash because nobody else in your league is even thinking about them. Over the last 10 games, this is a top 12 scoring unit in fantasy football, and they get a depleted New Orleans Saints offense fresh out of their bye week. This is a great defense to stash for round 1 of the fantasy playoffs, so if you have the room on your roster, get them stashed ASAP. Alrighty, y'all, that's it. That's all I've got for you here today, but before we sign off, remember, you can take the guesswork out of waiver wire decisions with FantasyPros Waiver Assistant. It will give you instant analysis on potential moves from over 100 fantasy experts. You'll also discover both the weekly and rest of season impact for every waiver ad. All you have to do is visit fantasypros.com/myplaybook or download the Fantasy Football My Playbook app. Again, all you have to do, visit fantasypros.com/myplaybook or download the Fantasy Football My Playbook app to optimize your roster today.